I'm Rashanah Baldwin, an award-winning TV and radio journalist, Chicagoan, and millennial. Someone You Need to Know explores the personal stories and journeys of trendsetters, tastemakers, societal change agents, and industry leaders. My goal is to introduce and connect you to everyday people doing impactful work across the country whose stories are often overlooked by the masses and often untold. Here's someone you need to know. Meet Dr. Barbara Ransby. A scholar, activist, author, and also a notable distinguished professor at UIC, my alum, where you were my professor. You have done a lot of great work. Start with January 6th. January 6th, the attack on the US Capitol. So many activists, Black activists, when I was watching Twitter and on social media was like, stand by and stand back, Black people. This is not our fight. This is not for us at the moment. What are your thoughts about that? Is that the right message to send to young activists who are out and been out prior to this?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes and no. Obviously, that was not the time to hit the streets, but are we implicated? I mean, is this in some ways a response to the upsurge in anti-racist protests? I think it is. I think that the kind of white nationalism that Donald Trump promoted and we saw and heard from that insurrectionist crowd on January 6th is a direct response, is a sort of racist response to people mobilizing in the street around George Floyd's murder and many other things. And so, so it is a struggle about the future of this country that we can't sit out. And if white vigilante mobs are going to attack the Capitol, we know that those kinds of mobs can quickly turn into lynch mobs, right? So we are familiar with violent white mobs as Black people in this country historically. And so, just to have a hands-off approach is not adequate. But there is a struggle. There's a struggle going on within the Republican Party. There's a struggle going on within the Democratic Party. There's struggle going on inside the United States as a whole. We have a stake certainly in the last two. And whatever happens with the Republicans is going to impact us too, because it's going to determine just how hostile and vicious they are to an agenda for Black people. So I don't think we can have a hands-off approach. I think we have to analyze it. I think we have to analyze the direction these groups are going in. It's very interesting that the head of the Proud Boys was exposed as having been an FBI informant. We know that a lot of police were involved from police forces around the country, were involved in the attempted coup. So all this has to be a part of building blocks of our analysis, but definitely we don't have the luxury to say, it doesn't concern us, because it's gonna impact us negatively one way or another. So we better be factoring it into our organizing and response efforts.
How should Black and brown people fight this form of white supremacy? And how do we fight this? How do we address this?
Yeah. Well, as you know, I'm a historian, but I'm also an activist and an organizer. So I work with a number of organizations nationally and locally. We can't fight back against racism by ourselves. I mean, as an individual, you can take a stand, you can reject racist comments when you hear them, you can try to leverage power in your work, but really we need organizations and we need movements. And so the Movement for Black Lives is a coalition of dozens of organizations all over the country that are figuring out how to push back against not only white supremacy, but racial capitalism, many of the systems that impact negatively, on our lives. So it's an organization that organizations belong to. Locally here in Chicago, there's something called the R3 Coalition, Resist, Reimagine, Rebuild Chicago, as well as a whole number of other organizations, from Black Lives Matter Chicago to Asada's Daughters. These organizations have, had activist agendas, have claimed victories. And so I encourage people to join and support those, or create an organization where you are. So it's organization, strategy, and movement building really that will move the needle in terms of justice and liberation. It's not going to mainly be the politicians. The politicians will respond to the strength of the movements we can build.
That kind of goes to my next question of the accountability, that the healing that everyone keeps saying, but I feel like what kind of accountability can we have before we heal as a nation? You addressed that, but I don't think a lot of people really understand how to do the accountability, and that we can't just jump straight to healing.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like a lot of the Republicans are saying, we just need to heal. We need to heal. We need to not do anything. Just
yeah. Well, it's particularly offensive when they say it because, you know, I mean, it's one thing to heal when something is over, but when you are still being harmed, it's particularly egregious to call for healing. I mean, you know, it's like you repairing the wound in my right arm and inflicting a wound in my left arm. So they are actively hurting and harming and jeopardizing the well-being of Black people, brown people, immigrants, Muslims, queer people every day in the policies that they advance and the policies that they obstruct. So from the Republicans, that's particularly offensive. Now, the Democrats have also talked a little bit about building unity and healing, but you know, there's a chant in movement circles, no justice, no peace, which is to say you can heal and build unity, but on a foundation of justice and accountability. And without that, you're just asking people to swallow the wounds and injustices that have been inflicted upon them. And that's, you know, simply put, not right and not acceptable.
is this an appropriate question of how do we get here again? How do we get, like, how, I feel like I know, but like, how do we get here again?
Well, you know, I mean, so as a historian, I'm always pushing back against this idea that history repeats because it really does, you know, it seems like it. It's like, this is way too familiar. But it doesn't really repeat. I mean, and I use the metaphor of a river, you know, like a river is flowing, it's constantly moving, right? So you could step in the river, you could go like take a nap, have your lunch, come back and put your foot in the river at the same place, but the water is different because the river's flowing. And so history is like that too. You know, so even if we see something very similar to what occurred before, the fact that a similar thing occurred before makes the current conditions different, right? Like we've been there, we know that, and to see this unfold again, you know, creates a difference just by virtue of us knowing and what has transpired in between, and it's a different moment. So, yes, we are at another moment of crisis around race. Race has been the perennial question, dilemma since this country's history. You know, a country built on the theft of Black labor, the enslavement of Black people, and the theft of indigenous land. And we've never reconciled with those injustices, those violent acts. And so naturally, we're going to be here again. If by here again, you mean a moment of crisis around race. I think also what we see in what happened on January 6th, is a counter narrative to the narrative that those of us in the Black freedom movement have, right? Our narrative is, and the narrative of Movement for Black Lives is, when Black people get free, when all Black people get free, everybody will be free, because Black people have been left out of a lot of the reforms and compromises over time. You know, people refer to what happened at the end of Reconstruction in the 19th century, when there was the big compromise in 1877. Well, it was Black people who got thrown under the bus. The troops pulled out of the South, and white vigilantes reasserted their power. Former slaveholders reasserted their power. So when we say when Black people get free, everybody gets free, that's what we mean. We mean that all-inclusive agenda for freedom and liberation. And until we reconcile with the past, we won't achieve that goal, and we will be, as you put it, here again.
In terms of me being a journalist and also a community leader from the South Side of Chicago, I often always was cautious about how I either protested or came out, and I said, you know, I'm gonna use my voice as a journalist to shape the narrative and change the narrative, and just really tell a balanced narrative? Do you feel or think when stories of Black protesters or Black people or white people are in, it is a difference of how they're portrayed in the media in terms of whether it's the mass shootings to the other mass shootings? Is that something that really needs to be corrected as a journalist when we like paid attention to? We saw it again as we January 6th to compare to what happened over the summer with Black Lives Matter. And I was really applauding a lot of journalists like, look at the difference. Is that important to keep calling that out and address that in terms of like changing that narrative and look how we are labeling?
Absolutely. I mean, not only is it important, it's essential. Truth telling is not about creating a false symmetry. And by that, what I mean is, well, they did this, so they did this. So it's not about a false symmetry. It's about understanding the context in which things occur. So there was a differential treatment by law enforcement, certainly of January 6th versus what happened in the summer. Oftentimes, the media will label instances of Black law breaking as riots and be much more sympathetic when they see whites doing this. One classic example that keeps coming up is during the Katrina hurricane disaster when, a Black family was labeled looters for taking food to survive, and a white family was seen as resourceful, making do in a crisis. So there's those kind of glaring examples. The other end of the spectrum is also things are not equal. Like when people have been oppressed for many centuries and they protest, that's a different phenomena than people who are called into insurrection by the President of the United States, given carte blanche by law enforcement that they meet at the doors, and assert their right and ownership of a country to the exclusion of other people. That's a different animal. That is a different phenomena. So we can't just be like, okay, there was a bunch of Black people in the street, there was a bunch of white people in the street, this is the same thing. It's not the same thing. One had a justice agenda and one had a repression agenda. So, anyway, so I think all these things, I think journalists, sometimes, we talk about objectivity.
Yeah.
You bring who you are. I mean, you said I'm a journalist and I'm, somebody who's, from the South Side of Chicago. So you bring that with you. Sometimes we talk about diversity in the university or in journalism. But what people mean is, I want somebody dipped in chocolate who's going to be just like everybody who's always done this job. Well, that's not diversity, that's decoration. So if you're going to bring diverse experiences in, those people are going to ask different questions. They're going to have different language and sensibilities. They're going to do the job differently. That's what diversity means. So, so I think you should, sort of own your own truths and bring your whole self into your work, which I think you're doing, and we'll all be better for it.
Has the country made any progress in race relations, or are we regressing? I often struggle with that question, and many people, those like, has anything changed?
Mm-hmm. Well, things always change, and you live long enough, things, things, of course, things change, but it's not like one linear progression to freedom. Like, okay, got a little more freedom, got a little more freedom. I mean, it's ebbs and flows, right? So 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 6 steps forward, 5 steps back. I mean, it is not just a ascendancy to freedom or to justice. So I do think we've made change, not because not the whole we. I mean, there's a lot of people in that we who have fought against the change, right? But I think it's an insult to elders and ancestors if we say things are just the way they always have been. They're not. I mean, the people fought and died to end chattel slavery. People fought and died to end Jim Crow segregation. People fought and died to make sure that Black people at least had some access to the ballot. People fought and died for, higher wages and working conditions. So all of these things make a difference. They don't solve and resolve the problem because you got people constantly working overtime to undo what you do. So it's important that we always remain vigilant and in motion. We don't just get free and sit down. So I think yes. So yes and no. We still have enormous problems. And I want to introduce this idea, which I'm sure you heard in some of my classes, this idea of racial capitalism, which is that, capitalism is a political and economic system, and it's a system that is predicated on a kind of mindless growth. Everything has to grow to be successful under capitalism, which has put us on a collision course with the planet, because water is not infinite, right? Land and oil is not infinite, it's finite. You get to the bottom of it and it's done, right? So, but capitalism has been on that collision course and has been built in tandem with the growth of white supremacy and racism. It justified free labor in its early period by saying Black people weren't really human and weren't citizens. So Black labor could be stolen to pick cotton and sugar and cultivate sugar and all kinds of commodities that made many people very rich and created a foundation for this country's wealth. That's the original sin. But that has persisted. Wage inequalities, wage differences, right? Exclusion from housing, surveillance and policing to preempt and undermine resistance. So it's not really just a question of us being included or integrated or treated fairly. It's really a question of systemic change. And I think we are in a moment where we need to think boldly in that regard. How can we organize the whole society differently so we don't have billionaires on the verge of becoming trillionaires, and then we have people down the street from me sleeping outside because they don't have housing? That is insane, it's immoral, it's criminal, and it's completely legal under this system, and it's wrong. And so that's at the crux of one of the things we have to wrestle with if we really want justice.
That brought me to a tweet I saw on social media by a friend who is on the right, and that's fine. And her tweet was, white supremacy in all my life has not really affected me. It was not having a father at home. I'm like, okay.
She was like, talking about a Black person saying that? No, I'm just clarifying.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was like, huh. She was like, majority of homes, Black homes, are without fathers. And I was like, white supremacy in the form of veils, KKK, may not have directly, but I was like, there's still that systematic piece, housing, education. And I just like, when you put messages out like that amplifies white supremacy and say, see, we're not, so.
Well, it's people grasp at straws to try to explain their condition. Yeah. And it's hard, I read books for a living and think about this stuff all the time, and I'm still confused at times, right? So none of us have the perfect answer, but I find the explanations that just focus on the individual, like my father wasn't there, or my mother didn't work hard enough, or my brother was on drugs. We all have personal stories and personal problems, but it's a question of, do we live in a society that helps improve those situations despite those problems, or makes them worse and creates some of them? Now, there are rich white people who use drugs. There are rich families where the father is absent one way or another. Either he's working 24/7, or he's with his, other family, or he's whatever, is not emotionally present for the children in that family, or is emotionally abusive. Lord only knows what Donald Trump's family is like, right. But those aren't people who would say, I didn't have a father, right? Because he was legally married to their moms or whatever. So I think we can look at personal situations and strip them of their political content, or not look at the counterpart. When you have whiteness and you have privilege, economic privilege, just like the Katrina example, the problems get labeled very differently. If somebody uses drugs in Winnetka, they get to go to a drug rehab program. Everybody's worried about them because they had such great potential. If somebody's addicted to drugs in Inglewood, they're evil, criminal, and they need to be locked up. So, this kind of disparity in terms of how we treat different personal problems. Now, that said, as individuals, yeah, we should step up for each other. We should step up in our families. There's personal responsibility, but that still doesn't let the system off the hook. So I would just say that white supremacy has probably affected that person in ways that they don't know.
Exactly.
And why, ask the question, why isn't their dad there? But also ask the question is, why is that the critical variable? We have lots of movie stars who have lots of money, and they split up all the time. It seems like, the marriages last, every 5 minutes they're gone. But they have a lot of money. So they have other people helping to take care of their kids, or they pay people to do other things so that they can be with their kids. Whatever they do, we don't seem to pathologize that in the way that we do in Black. Anyway, that's probably a longer answer than you
No,
want.
that's absolutely perfect. And I know we are coming up on time. I have maybe two more questions specifically about the Biden-Harris administration. What should their priorities be? Two, right the wrongs that was for Black people. Not necessarily during the Trump, the era of the Trump, but there's a lot of wrongs that need to be written.
Yeah.
What would you say the priority should be?
Yeah, I mean, I was on a big panel about this yesterday in terms of what has Biden done, what can he do. I was not a huge Biden fan, okay? He definitely was, I think we definitely were settling. He was better than Trump. Of course, Kermit the Frog would be better than Trump. So I think many of us voted against Trump rather than for Biden. But that said, some of the executive orders around private prisons, the executive orders around immigration and reversing the Muslim ban, the executive order to give, to put a moratorium on foreclosures and evictions, and to give people, more stimulus money or survival money, really. All those things are good. They're both good and not enough. This government spends enormous amount of money on military, enormous amount of money on tax cuts for the wealthy. People need help, right? That's why you have a government. These people with perverse ideas about the government shouldn't be helping you. You pay taxes. What do you have a government for if it's not going to help people? I mean, that is nuts. So much more should be done. When we look at something like the private prison, stopping contracts with private prisons only make up 9%. And we've got lots of Black and brown people for nonviolent offenses, many of them, in jails and prisons. That's 91% that are not going to be affected by these canceling these contracts with private prisons. Although I do think it's a good thing. I think private prisons are particularly predatory and greedy and not accountable, etc. So anyway, I'll give you shorter answers. I think look at the Movement for Black Lives.org website, and they have something called the Breathe Act, which outlines things. I very much support the Green New Deal. I support the Poor People's Campaign. They have a 14-point set of demands of what Biden should do in the first 100 days. So I think all those things are good starting points.
Okay. You said, is it breed or breathe?
Breathe.
Okay.
Like Eric Garner couldn't breathe, yeah. So it's like the Breathe Act.
Yeah. I do hope we never see any more of those issues, situations. Now, I got maybe one final question and a half. I know you are a busy woman doing amazing work. What would your advice be to the VP, the first Black woman VP? There's a lot of pressure on her to make the most out of this. What advice would you, give her?
Yeah, I mean, again, she's not the most progressive person in the world either. And I think hopefully we're sophisticated enough to know Black and brown faces in high places does not always translate into liberation for the rest of us. So I think she needs to push Joe Biden and not just be his sidekick.
Mm-hmm.
I think she needs to listen to the Black community and the Black women that organized to get her on the ticket and get her elected. And those forces are asking for bold, radical changes, radical in the best sense of the word, radical in terms of getting to the root cause of problems, and not just putting band-aids on the solution. And certainly, not middle of the road kind of solutions, which is what Biden has been known for in the past. There is no Republican Party with any ounce of integrity to partner with. So I think what they have to do is use executive orders, use the bully pulpit of the presidency and the vice presidency, and she has to do that too. I mean, one of the problems with Barack Obama, there were many, was he wanted everybody to love him. Everybody's not going to love you. As many somersaults as you can turn, as many reassurances as you can give, everybody is not going to love you. So realize you are there to serve your people and do that job, not the job that other people want you to do.
Thank you, Barbara Ransby. Did I say your name correctly?
Sorry?
Dr. Barbara Ransby.
You could call me Barbara. You can call me Dr. Ransby. It's all good.
You're my professor. Where can we find you? You're doing so much work. Please give us all your contact information because I want to continue this conversation. I hope we can have a part 2. You have so much to offer and share.
Yeah. So I have a Twitter, at Barbara Ransby. And then I have a website, which is barbaransby.com. So I put up, when I'm on a program, I try to share things on there. So I think that's where people can find me. I'm still, I'm active in many organizations, and I still run the Social Justice Initiative at UIC. And we're doing some interesting things that I'm excited about there. That's my day gig. But yeah, I'm very proud of you doing this work, and I hope you will take the advice that I offered for Kamala Harris, right? Don't try to live up to somebody else's expectations, but be your authentic self and be in service to people who need you.
I greatly appreciate you and your work, Dr. Barbara Ransby, scholar, activist, author, and professor at UIC. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rashanah. Take care.